We're very privileged to have Professor Robert Vivian here with us today. He's professor at Wits University since 1989. He's professor of finance and insurance. He's an expert in economic theory of insurance and practice and law, and he has 37 years in the industry. So he's I would say he's probably the leading expert in South Africa on the insurance market. He's published books, academic papers. He's frequently in the media. He will be in the media this evening and this afternoon on Business Day TV and Classic FM if you'd like to listen in later. We also have Leon Louw, the Executive Director of the Free Market Foundation, who's going to introduce the topic and set the scene. He's also going to introduce a video which we're going to show to you, which gets to the heart of what Twin Peaks is all about and why it's a very important topic for all of us. When I asked Leon what I should say about him, he said I had to say that he specializes in worthless information. So that is Leon. So I'm going to go straight into asking Leon to come up and introduce the video and set the scene for us.
Thanks, Jane. This is difficult and yet easy to set the scene. It's difficult because this is such an important piece of legislation, and easy because it's such a stupid piece of legislation. And I hope that'll be clear by the time we're done. It seems to me sometimes that we have people in South Africa who are important in the policy area who are absolutely determined to destroy the country. They want to make sure nobody invests. They want to make sure the economy doesn't function efficiently. They want to make sure that there's misallocation of scarce resources, especially the most important resource of all, which is finance. It is as if we had a think tank that got together and said, what can we do to stop all these people who are trying to do profit-making, profitable, sensible transactions with each other? How can we go about disrupting it? All of these people who are so busy trying to be efficient and trying to allocate wealth and trying to produce wealth, can't we come up with better plans to frustrate and destroy the process? It's as if there are very brainy people sitting around coming up with ingenious ways of destroying the economy, causing unemployment, causing misallocation of resources, and certainly making sure we drive investors away. And often when people talk about driving investors away, they imagine them to be foreign investors. No. Before you get foreign investors, you have to get local investors. And the investors you drive away are the local investors, and the foreign investors just don't come at all. You never drive them away because they weren't here in the first place. And so we will see a video which explains what is going on. And that video is long. It's 15 minutes, which is long for this sort of video, and you'll see why it's long. If you can think of a way of making the video shorter, let us know. We tried. Because once you try to describe, even in the most rudimentary, superficial terms, what is being proposed under the so-called Twin Peaks legislation, you will see that it is such a mess, such a shambles, such chaos, that it actually can't be described. And it's so bad, in my view, that I doubt if anyone in the country, if there is one single human being, including the author or authors of the legislation, or the directors general, or the people who worked on it, who could actually tell you what's in it, who could actually describe it. It is too chaotic, too messy, too shambolic, I think, for a single human being, any human being in the whole of South Africa, to comprehend quite what's in it. If Professor Vivian can, then my hat's off to him, but I doubt if he can really work out what it all means and how it all fits together. It is called Twin Peaks, and it is actually not Twin Peaks, it's multiple peaks. There are at least 3 big peaks. I don't know how we stop that happening, but we'll get there. Which are the Department of Health, maybe a 4th, the Trade and Industry, but certainly the Reserve Bank, South African SARB Reserve Bank, and the Treasury, or the Financial Services Board as it is now called, will become the Market Conduct Authority if this goes ahead, and we are hoping that it's not too late to stop it. It is madness that must be stopped. And And it shouldn't be called twin peaks, it's twin daggers or twin spears. This is a dagger in the side of anyone who wants to provide or receive as a consumer a financial service or product. There is no meaningful socio-economic impact assessment for it. There is a nominal one, a token one, but whoever wrote it, whoever produced it, clearly didn't bother to read the guidelines on the president approved by the cabinet unanimously, which are actually not bad. Everyone could want to add a bit of an improvement, but they're actually very good. And if they complied with their own the cabinet's guidelines, there would not be this draft legislation before us. One of the things that's required by the cabinet, by the guidelines, for which we have a special government unit in the Department of Planning, is that, for example, that there must be clear benefits. It's, to use the term business people are familiar with, cost-benefit analysis. It specifies no benefits, just some amorphous kind of that things will be better one day. Trust us, we know. There is no quantifiable, as is required, benefit specified or calculated or worked out, who in fact will be better off as a result of this. Under the previous legislation, which was much less pernicious and much less likely to do any harm, the phase legislation, the best they could tell us was that they delisted 16,000 financial service providers, as if that was something to be proud of, and you don't have to be very bright to guess what color those people largely were, the people entering the market, the emerging financial service providers, and you don't have to be very proud to know what socio-economic group their customers were in and are no longer getting financial services or products. And you don't need to be very bright to know what color most of them would have been. This is what's been achieved until now. Pure destruction. No measurable benefit whatsoever to anybody other than the giant bureaucratic empire which enriches itself to an extraordinary degree, imposes levies or taxes, imposes penalties and fines, keeps the money, spends the money on themselves. They are clearly beneficiaries, and that is why they want even more feeding at this trough. The supposed first spear or dagger or peak is the Treasury or the financial services, the market conduct regulator. And the second one is the South African Reserve Bank. Now let's understand that. There's lots of talk about the Reserve Bank being nationalized. It's based on an assumption that the Reserve Bank is some sort of private white monopoly capital enterprise that runs around serving its interests and doing what it wants. It is, for practical purposes, autonomous, but more importantly, it has been an implementing agency. It does, for example, exchange control or interest rates. It doesn't decide, it doesn't regulate interest rates or regulate exchange control. It's simply the implementing agency of the Treasury that does that. Now, it is proposed to turn it into a regulator that in smoke-free, quiet rooms in Pretoria will make regulations governing the financial services sector's prudential function, its liquidity. That in itself is not too bad, and it can be actually quite a simple job, even though it's with the wrong branch of government to be doing that. The big problem, for me at least, is the Market Conduct Authority. This is now going to be regulating financial services down to the smallest minutiae. The whole notion that a bunch of bureaucrats who have never themselves provided any financial services, had any market experience, run a successful business, can sit around, and if you know a single person who's a member of the Financial Services Board, you are unusual. The most powerful people in the country are not the cabinet, not the ANC, not the Reserve Bank, but the Financial Services Board. And the board members are mysterious, secret people who almost no one knows about, who sit around making regulations. They will do so even more now. And there's the most obvious thing about this is the total economic illiteracy that's involved. That a market conduct authority of little grey people sitting in smoke-free rooms secretly in Pretoria concocting regulations, not in Cape Town, where the legislature is, that's where laws ought to be made, but in a little room in Pretoria, well, big room, a big lavish luxury room in Pretoria, or some retreat on Bali or somewhere. They have no understanding. They don't, I mean, it's based on an assumption that markets don't work, as if there's no price mechanism, no knowledge of what competition is. And this myth that they know somehow better what new product should be allowed, how it should be marketed, what the terms and conditions of it ought to be. This is the notion that's behind it. So, with these tentacles that are being created, that will stretch into every aspect of everybody's life, we are going to now watch the video, and then Professor Vivian will do what I would call the trench warfare description of it, and so we'll see it, and bear with us. It's a 15-minute video.
Have you heard that National Treasury has convinced Parliament to introduce a bewildering new Twin Peaks system for financial services regulation in South Africa? The financial services sector comprises two sectors, banks and insurance. Each sector has had their own regulatory authority for well over 100 years. In other words, banks currently have a single regulator or peak, and insurers currently have a single regulator or peak. That is, they each have one master for all matters that affect them. The current single peak system proved 100% effective throughout the 2008 financial crisis and proved 100% effective in dealing with the handful of cases of market abuse. Under the proposed experimental Twin Peaks system, each sector will now have two separate and independent masters, together with a bewildering array of committees, laws, and ministers. Exactly the same two peaks will control both banks and insurers. This short video illustrates that Twin Peaks is the most complex and expensive regulatory experiment in the history of the country. It is clearly doomed. Twin Peaks is a complex and therefore massively expensive bureaucratic system that will cost consumers a minimum of 4.8 billion rand per year every year. That's equivalent to approximately 500,000 RDP homes or 5,000 new clinics per year every year. Compliance costs are always carried by consumers. Treasury's experimental system will raise the price of financial services, which particularly impacts the vulnerable and the poor. In addition, this complexity will act as a barrier to emerging players in the financial sector. No attempt has been made by Treasury to show what is wrong with the current simple single peak system. No empirical research has been done to show what problem exists which needs addressing, how extensive it is, or even whether there is a problem at all. In addition, Treasury has not bothered to outline the measurable benefits of the new Twin Peaks idea. The new system will not achieve any practical outcome. Let's look at the current structure or architecture for the regulation of banks in South Africa. The South African Reserve Bank appoints the Registrar of Banks, who has oversight over licensing, reporting, and financial soundness for all banks. Now let's look at the current structure or architecture for the regulation of insurers in South Africa. The Financial Services Board, or FSB, is an autonomous organization which was brought about by a separate Act of Parliament in 1990. The FSB appoints the registrar, who has oversight over licensing, conduct, enforcement, redress, reporting, and financial soundness for all insurance companies. The current structure of regulation of financial services in South Africa is simple, easy to manage, and easy to understand. Everyone knows where to go when dealing with their matters. The regulatory hierarchy is clear. The current single peak architecture comprises one regulator each, one department each, one financial sector board each, and one policy setting body each. Now let's look at what is to come in terms of the Financial Sector Regulation Bill, the FSRB, better known as Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks has been sold to Parliament as having been designed to defragment the regulation of financial services in South Africa. Let us see just how defragmented the new architecture is to be. Twin Peaks proposes to simultaneously involve no less than 3 cabinet ministers in financial services regulation: the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Trade and Industry, and believe it or not, the Minister of Health. The minister and their staff will serve on the Financial Sector Interministerial Council, or FSIC. Twin Peaks is in fact a fragmented, multi-layered structure that looks more like a pyramid or Ponzi scheme than a legitimate regulatory agency. The Twin Peaks are the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, or FSCA, and the Prudential Authority, or PA. The Twin Peaks have divided up between them this list of regulatory items with notable overlapping. So under Peak 1, the Financial Services Conduct Authority controls the conduct of banks and insurers in respect of licensing, conduct, enforcement, redress, and reporting. And under Peak 2, the Prudential Authority controls the solvency of banks and insurers in respect of licensing, conduct, enforcement, redress, reporting, and financial soundness. As you can see, there is considerable overlap between the roles of the 2 independent peaks, this overlap being the central cause of the complexity which now follows. The Financial Sector Interministerial Council will be an overarching committee whose role includes trying to manage the Twin Peaks and the conflicting, overlapping activity between them. The Financial Sector Conduct Authority will report directly to the Minister of Finance, while the Prudential Authority will report to the South African Reserve Bank, which is independent of the Minister of Finance. But wait, there's more. The Twin Peaks are created and managed by a highly complex structure. The Twin Peaks are managed by and directed by no less than 7 committees, commissioners, governors, and the like, each of whom has the power to effectively direct or at least derail the other. The FSRB creates an inscrutable mishmash of cross-reference committees, boards, panels, tribunals, forums, officials, and regulators. The Executive Committee, the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioners, the Sub-Executive Committees, the Prudential Authority Oversight Committee, the Prudential Committee, the Governor, Deputy Governors, Chief Executive, the subcommittees, all of whom will want to ensure their influence is felt. So the Twin Peak regulators will actually have many masters of their own. But it doesn't end there. Each of the 7 committees, commissioners, governors, and the like that direct their own peak will give direction to the other peak. The Twin Peaks authorities are required to further consult with the following committees and forums: the Financial Stability Oversight Committee, the Financial Sector Contingency Forum, the Financial System Council of Regulators. These committees include the influence, direction, and control of the other 2 ministers, that is, the Minister of Trade and Industry and the Minister of Health. The Minister of Trade and Industry, after dealing with the Financial Sector Interministerial Council, will appoint, regulate, and control the National Consumer Commission, the Competition Commission, and the National Credit Regulator, all of whom will have representation on the FSOC, the FSCF, and the FSCR. The Minister of Health, however, through his Council for Medical Schemes, will have representation not only on the Financial Sector Interministerial Council, but will appoint Council for Medical Scheme representatives to the Financial System Council of Regulators. Also serving on the FSOC, the FSCF, and the FSCR will be representatives of the Financial Intelligence Center, who themselves report to the Minister of Finance. Should any crisis occur, then in terms of the FSRB, a new coordinating committee must be formed. The Administrative Action Committee, which will take administrative action against the source of the crisis, if any. So, It is clear that the Twin Peaks authorities in fact have no authority to act on their own and must act subject to their own oversight committees and the oversight policy committees to which they belong, the FSOC, the FSCF, and the FSCR, prior to making any final decisions with regard to the actions of either Peak 1 or Peak 2. If you thought this was complex, wait, there's more. To make matters even more complex, in the event you understand what is going on at this stage, a new Ombuds Board will be formed together with a tribunal and appeals panel. They will be called into being in order to constitute a new Ombud Regulatory Council, or ORC. The ORC will now take responsibility for the currently independent and voluntary the Ombudsman for short-term insurance, the Ombudsman for long-term insurance, the Ombud for financial advisory and intermediary services, the Ombudsman for banking services, the pension fund adjudicator, the credit ombudsman, all of whom will report via the ORC to the Minister of Finance, but will give no input to the oversight and contingency committees that are formed under the Twin Peaks authorities. The proposed Twin Peaks architecture comprises 3 cabinet ministers, finance, trade and industry, and health, 3 government departments, treasury, trade and industry, and health, 4 financial sector councils or committees, the FSCF, FSCR, the FSIC, and the FSOC, 4 financial services supervisors, the CMS, the FSCM, the NCR, and the PA. 9 regulation-setting bodies, the CC, CMS, FIC, FSCA, FSOC, NCC, NCR, ORC, and PA. And the 20 Acts of Parliament with an additional 4 new acts proposed. The Banks Act 94 of 1990, the Collective Investment Schemes Control Act 46 of 2002, the Consumer Protection Act, the Credit Rating Services Act, the Financial Advisory and Intermediary Services Act, the Financial Institutions Protection of Funds Act, the Financial Intelligence Center Act, the Financial Markets Act, the Financial Sector Regulation Act, the Financial Supervision of the Road Accident Fund Act, the Friendly Societies Act, the Insurance Act, the Long-Term Insurance Act, the National Credit Act, the Pension Fund Act, the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, the Promotion of Access to Information Act, the Protection of Personal Information Act, the Short-Term Insurance Act, the South African Reserve Bank Act. The proposed new acts are the Conduct of Financial Institutions Act, the Financial Markets Act, the Financial Sector Levies Act, the Resolution, Insolvency and Business Rescue for Financial Institutions Act. This is not Twin Peaks at all. It is multiple peaks and sub-peaks. It is an inscrutable, highly fragmented structure. Compared to the current structure, it is almost indecipherably complex, highly inefficient, and massively expensive. Already the finance sector is inundated daily with interpretive notes, directives, board, notices, regulations, rules, and standards. Twin Peaks promises more of the same. It is an administrative system with no clear benefits. Indeed, Treasury's own impact assessment lists no measured problem to solve and no measurable benefit to be achieved. But wait, there's more. The money bill that now accompanies the FSRB makes no provision for the constitutionally required budget and appropriation bill to be passed by Parliament, thereby rendering the entire Twin Peaks bill illegal. The question to be asked is why? Why this hopelessly inefficient, grossly expensive system? Why no properly researched problem? Why no properly stated benefits? Is it worth 500,000 new homes or 5,000 new clinics every year? Or is it just another way of capturing funds for bloated bureaucratic adventures? Whilst you are pondering on these questions, consider some of the bewildering array of committees, forums, laws and institutions brought by or referred to in the FSRB. The Minister of Finance must be called upon to withdraw this Twin Peaks bill immediately.
I must say that when we looked at this, everybody tells me it's a boring video. I don't think it's boring at all. I think it's quite interesting. It is incomprehensible, but then the bill is incomprehensible and the system is incomprehensible. But I certainly didn't find the video boring. I thought it was quite good. Thanks a lot. I think with something which is as complex as this, it's rather difficult to know where to start because it touches on so many issues that we could spend several weeks trying to unfathom it and to try to see the implications. So I can only do the best I can in the time which is available to do so. So what I'm really going to argue is exactly what is argued in the video, that the Twin Peaks should not actually be put into place. We should rather stay with our existing system and refine that system, which itself is in need of some improvement, but it's going to be far better than the system which we have got. So if you understand the video up to this point, as soon as I work out how to get it, what is it and what does it cost? So trying to take the act which we spent several weeks looking at to try and unfathom and interpret, try to give it some meaning and then summarize it in what is it. At this stage, as you can see, it is simply a complex system of committees. I think if you ever worked with the government, then you'll know that makes sense, because to a government official, the answer to every question is a committee meeting. So it's not surprising that we're ending up with a series of complex committees. It will cost 4.8 billion rand per annum. That's the figure which the government gave in its social economic impact assessment. My own estimate is 6 billion, simply because it's easier for me to round it off. There's 2 peaks, 1 billion each. The current peak is costing 1 billion. We're going to put another one in. That's going to cost another 1 billion. And for every rand that you spend to the regulator, the private sector spends at least 2 rands to try and to implement that. Now, how do I know that? Whenever the Financial Services Board says, let us have a meeting, sets up a meeting, one representative turns up and about 400 from the companies turn up. So there's really a ratio of 1 to 400. I say let's make a 1 to 2, make it very conservative. So that's very easy. There's one peak is going to cost 3 billion, another peak going to cost 3 billion, 1 billion to the regulators, 2 billion paid by the industry. It's very interesting to ask who that 2 billion rand goes to, because you'll understand once 1 billion rand a year, 2 billion rand a year is paid to people, there's an incentive to make sure the system continues. It becomes self-supporting. A very interesting economic question which we're going to give. Now there are 2 peaks. Now I think what's very important to understand, because it's easy to misunderstand this particular point, these peaks exist. So there's money already being spent, and it has been spent for a long time. So the argument that I'm putting is not against regulation. The argument I'm putting against is changing the regulatory architecture to make this very complex system, when we could continue with the system we've got, which would be much more economically effective and has worked for 100 years, and we know of no problem which has been identified to justify this additional expense. So it is very important. It's not an argument against regulation. We already have regulation. It's been in place for a long time. It's against this complicated architecture, which I don't believe is going to achieve anything. Now, the one peak is the Prudential regulation. That peak is to make sure that financial institutions do not go insolvent. So if you invest in a bank, you would like to get your money out of the bank. If you buy an insurance policy, you would like to make sure that that insurance company will pay the loss when it occurs. So the Prudential side is to make sure that institutions are financially sound and can deliver it. That at the moment is costing 300 million rand per annum. So, and that's just for non-banks. We haven't taken the bank figures in. If you brought that in, it's an amount which is considerably greater. And there's a market conduct, and it's currently costing 600 million rand. So from nothing in 2002 to 600 million rand. So you can see it's grown much faster in cost-wise than the other peak. My estimates, R1 billion to the regulator, 2 billion rand of industry cost, which will be to comply with the legislation, and for each of those particular peaks. But I say the important point, because when I have done this discussion, people say, but are you saying no regulation? We always need regulation because, there are crooks out there. We're already spending R1 billion on regulation, 3 billion rand in total on regulation. So this is not a case against regulation. Regulation exists as against a complex architectural structure. Okay, now, what are the benefits? This is a big issue, because you're going to spend 6 billion rand a year, or you're going to extort 6 billion rand out of the private sector. You want to at least get the feeling that you're going to get some benefit out of it. Now, in all the years that this has been promulgated, no benefit has yet been identified. There's been numerous reports, numerous presentations to Standing Committee at Parliament. The Standing Committee itself has reported to Parliament. None of them have ever been able to identify any specific benefits, and certainly no one has been able to identify a financial benefit, to say that's the benefit and that's the cost which we will reap. We will spend that amount of money, but that's the financial return we're going to get out of it. So we don't have the benefit, let alone the financial benefit we've got. Now, when I say that, let us look at some of the explanations which have been given for this particular legislation. The study in which is supposed to set out the cost to benefit study, the social economic impact assessment, Leon has already referred to, a cabinet requirement that on all legislation that this assessment be done. And so eventually assessment was done, and then had to try and study it very carefully to say, okay, what are the benefits which we are going to get out of that? Now, those are the benefits which we've given: a stable and more inclusive sector. Well, first of all, our financial system weathered the financial crisis without any problems at all. So our financial sector is stable, already has been stable for 100 years. So it's difficult to see that this benefit will come from it, because it does already exist without the 6 billion rand being spent. The inclusive is something completely different, and that is a problem in itself. Because if you say what caused the world financial crisis, many will say it was the subprime crisis in the United States. And so what the United States government tried to do is to force inclusivity within the financial system and then pull down the entire system. So we have an objective here to pull down the South African system to make it stable. So those two statements are mutually exclusive. And one would doubt whether exclusivity is actually a regulatory objective. So when you're looking at this to say, why are we doing it? It's impossible to find out that reason. Then later on, the assessment says it's for the benefit of society as a whole. Well, how is this benefit going to be reaped from what we're going to do? And what is this benefit? Because the market is stable already. We can't make it inclusive. When you go to the Standing Committee, now the Standing Committee is very important, because what happens, this is the committee that reports back to Parliament. So when Parliament is going to vote on it, this is the explanation that's given to Parliament as to why we're going to extort 6 billion rand out of the public. It then refers back to the financial crisis of 2008 and says we're going to fix the roof while the sun is shining. In other words, we have no problems. We want to spend 6 billion rand, so when we get the problem, we're not going to have the problem we never had. So it's not a justification for being able to do that. And even if we spend 6 billion rand per annum in South Africa, the problem came from the subprime crisis in the United States of America. Nothing we do in South Africa is going to stop the Americans do what they're doing, causing a problem back into South Africa. So we can send the 6 billion rand, but fixing the roof while the sun is shining will not produce the benefit. And what we're trying to see is what's the benefit of this legislation. And so the explanation given to Parliament says we have no benefit, so let's fix the roof when the sun is shining. In case one day this happens, then we have all our ducks in a row. When the Problem came, the ducks were in a row. So it's not clear how this is going to make the ducks more in a row than which were already in a row. Or, putting it the other way, which is the way I prefer to put it, the existing system worked fine. Let's keep with the existing system. Now there's an interesting statement which I personally found very intriguing in the notification to Parliament. It says that, you know, it's very difficult to bring about a regulation in the industry because there's a pushback from the industry. Now I must say, as far as I know in this country, I'm the only person pushing back. We can't get the industry to push back. And as the industry, every time you say we want to do this, they say, fantastic idea, let's do it. And I say, but it's destructive. Fantastic idea, let's do it. Now I'm not sure why the Standing Committee then goes to Parliament and said that they've encountered a considerable pushback from the industry when I do not know of that pushback at all. Then this is a favourite one which has been given at the world economic crisis, financial crisis, took place because the market was not regulated. Now, Mervyn King, who's the governor of the Reserve Bank of the bank, was the governor of the Reserve Bank of England, had a particular problem, and that problem is what resulted in the Twin Peaks, which we're going to have a look. And then what he then said to some of his staff, can you please go and talk to the FSA and find out how many pages of regulation they have for the financial services. They came back and said over 10,000 pages. So there is no such thing as light touch regulation. There never was such thing as light touch regulation. And now we're going to end up with what they've called an intrusive and draconian system, where the regulator wants to have the arbitrary right to go to any financial institution and tell that institution to do anything he likes without any law at all, because we had an unregulated market. We never had an unregulated market. Daniel Hanna, the Member of Parliament, when he was presenting a paper on this, said the banking industry is the most highly regulated industry in the world, other than possibly the nuclear energy industry. So it's always been the most highly regulated market in the world. Misleading Parliament. There has never been a light touch, and now we are going to end up with thousands of pages of directives, as we will see under this thing over here. The regulated expenses is essentially a deadweight cost. Now that's really quite important, because what happens, we can't see any benefit from the legislation. We can't see any financial benefit from that. So that means whenever you're spending money, the 6 billion rands, there is nothing coming back. So that is merely an expense on the part of the private sector to fund this arrangement without any benefit. So that expense is simply a deadweight cost. It's not a cost which is going to produce a benefit. 10 years of the motivations by the government for this has not been able to produce that benefit. So the cost is simply a deadweight cost. Secondly, even if we accept a stable and more inclusive society is what we want, this is going to benefit society in particular. As you saw from that video, if you can tell me how you think that is going to produce the outcome. So there's no connection that we could see, or I could see, between what the Twin Peaks says it's going to do and the outcomes which it's going to get. So we have this array of committees, and we don't know how it's supposed to produce any of those things. Presumably the argument is once we start doing it, the benefits will start flowing, benefits which we do not know. But as that bill now stands, the one which is just passed, you can't see a connection between what is happening and those particular objectives which we will be looking at. Okay. Now the main conclusion that I would come to is our existing system does everything that we want to do more effectively, more efficiently, at a fraction of costs. So does the new system add anything? Well, that's easy to try and answer. As complex as it is, we can say that what we have is a new system of committees upon committees and interlinking committees and more committees. And so all we have to do is say, well, let's have a look at how successful committees have been in the past. Let's look at the current system where there were committees and ask ourselves, well, how did those committees work? And believe it or not, we had two committees. And so interministerial committees and all those things, they're not new, they worked. They were in the legislation. So let's just have a look at how these things worked. And within the system that we've got, where everybody reporting to somebody, that is more like a managerial hierarchy. And let's have a look how that has worked in practice in the past. So that's what we will have a look. So committees as solutions to real problems. As I said, anybody who's worked with a government, in the government, will know that the answer to a government official for every problem is a committee meeting. So it's not altogether surprising that we've ended up with an act of committees, because that's the psyche of a bureaucrat. That's what happens. Now, the existing structure, the one which I think is the one we should continue with, is really quite a sound structure. It's based on one market, one regulator. So we talk about twin peaks. We actually have a number of peaks, and that is for each regulator. And so we have a holistic single-peak market regulator at the moment. Prudential matters. Started looking at Prudential in 1871, so we've had a long history of Prudential matters, which is the 300 billion rand. Now, the market conduct is very brand new. It started in 2002, and the cost has gone from that period to double what the Prudential regulator has taken over a century to get to. So it's great. Now, it's really based on a very simple economics statement, which comes from the first Nobel Prize winner in economics, Jan Tinbergen, first Nobel laureate in 1969. You can see the architecture was put in place at that time when he was getting the Nobel Prize. Simply one policy, one instrument. It says if the government wants to achieve anything, define what that policy is, and then take one instrument. You can't have multiple policies, you can't have multiple industries, it will never work. So that's a great advice which Jan Tinbergen gave in 1969. Now have a look how that has worked with the central bank, and then just think of what the public protector tried to do to the central bank, and you'll understand why it not worked. Central bank says we have got one problem, the stability of the currency, that's all. We have one instrument, interest rates. Inflation was brought down from 25%, as we will see in 1975, to 1%. One instrument, one policy. Works like a dream. Now, of course, our public protector wanted to add a whole lot of more policies, and there will be more instruments, and the Reserve Bank would not have worked. Fortunately, as far as the Reserve Bank is, we have learnt a little lesson. Of course, we are trying to mess that around, which I will argue later on is unconstitutional, by giving the Reserve Bank, without changing the constitution in which its mandate is set out, the prudential regulation of other financial instruments. It doesn't have that role at the moment, never has had that role, and I would argue it can't be done until you change the constitution. It's going to be able to do that at all. In line with that policy, what the system now exists is one act of parliament for one market. One market, one regulation, one act. Insurance industry market was regulated by the Insurance Act, and then there was an insurance regulator, the registrar. Pensions Act, pensions regulator, the pensions registrar. Worked like a dream without any problems at all. Now what we believe, or clearly who drafted this legislation, is we can do away with what is economically sound and then replace that with a series of committees. Now there were two committees which existed in terms of the old legislation. One is an advisory committee. So every act, every market had an advisory committee, and that consisted of people from the industry who met with the regulator, or the registrar, to keep him informed with what's happening in the industry. And so that was the system which took place. And then to make sure that there was consistency, there was a policy committee, which then looked at what was happening in each of these different markets to make sure there was consistency across it, which existed when these acts were eventually drafted. Now, let's have a look at how these committees worked. In 1986, the AA Mutual collapsed, and the Commission of Inquiry was chaired by Mr. Justice David Malamed, and the registrar then appeared before the committee and said, the Commission said to him, we've had a lot of evidence that the AA Mutual was having a lot of problems, and the market knew about it, but you did not know about it. And he said, no, I had no idea that this was happening at all. So then David Malamed said to him, but what about the advisory committee? Because didn't they advise you? Oh, he said, we haven't called an advisory committee in years. So we put the committees in place, and when you want them, they're not there. They do not work. And we had the policy committee, which was now supposed to consider, and it had its own act, which was the Policy Form and Financial Regulatory Services Act. When that was promulgated in 1993, great newspaper coverage, and great plump at 70 as the Reserve Bank, as it went to its inaugural meeting. When I was doing research into this, I got hold of the FSB and I said, now what has happened to the policy committee? Oh, that hasn't met for years. So we are going to put in a series of committees, and they do not work. Now, in England, the same thing happened with Twin Peaks we are simply following the failed UK system. So they already had that system. They had a single peak regulator, and that had everything over there, and that single peak was a Financial Services Authority. And then they realized that the Financial Services Authority is regulating banks, and everything in all financial, all into one thing. And then they said, but what happens if we have a crisis? No, there will be an inter-ministerial committee that will sit and meet and resolve it, same as what we are planning at this particular time. So when the crisis arrives, the chairman of the FSA will meet, the governor of the bank will meet, National Treasury will meet. Now what you must do is just go and read the inquiries into what happened here there, which they say we have had total chaos. Those committees, when they were assembled, could do absolutely nothing. Eventually, in utter frustration, Mervyn King, the governor of the Reserve Bank, said, please, if you want us to solve the problem, give us the authority to solve the problem. These committees do not solve problems. That is the reason why we have Twin Peaks. They then decided to return the banks to the Bank of England, so that when you have a crisis, it can do something, instead of sitting and have coffee over committee meetings which are going to achieve absolutely nothing. So, the main architectural structure, as you have seen from the video, is a series of committees. Our experience with a series of committees is they simply do not work. And the important point for you to take from here, at this point I'll then emphasize it again a bit later, the reason we have got Twin Peaks in this country is to correct the mistake the UK had by making a single peak. It's to give back to the Reserve Bank the banks to regulate, so when there is a crisis, it can regulate those banks. So they had to go to the FSA and take from the FSA the banks and give it back to the Bank of England. We never did that, so we have no need for the Twin Peaks problem. There's 140 countries in the world, and of the 140, as far as we can make, only 3 of us now got the Twin Peaks. Why have we got Twin Peaks? Because we just followed the UK. And the other one who followed it is Australia. Australia tried to convince China they should have a Twin Peaks. They were not too successful with their convincing of China. So it has no real theoretical merit, and the systems of committees which are almost impossible to understand. Our experience, not our experience, the experience the world has had, they do not produce any results. As we know, answer to a real problem is not a committee meeting, it's taking real action, which you need to take under those circumstances. Okay, but there's another problem, because I don't think what actually realized, we do actually have a super peak, because what I have taken great pains to tell you, the system which should work, one market, one regulator. So pension should have its own regulator, insurance should have its own regulator, the equity market have its own regulator. We have a market regulator, which is the Financial Services Board, came into operation in 1990. And the other thing you must remember about this video is the managerial hierarchy which you get. So you don't have a regulator who is responsible only to the law, he's responsible to somebody senior to him, to someone senior to him. So the question is, how does this managerial system function within a regulatory environment? And we have a very fortunate, and thanks to Rosemary Hunter, we have a clear understanding how this system works. It replaces the rule of law with a managerial centralism, as we will see. So each market had its own registrar. Note they didn't call them regulators, just registrars. And we had the first super registrar, which is the CEO of the Financial Services Board. When the act was formed, it said, okay, the chief executive officer, he will be the regulator of all the markets. So we have a single peak regulator already. So we've already gone somewhere down the wrong way to establish, to violate the principle, one market, one regulator, to one market over all the financial markets. Now, the Rosemary Hunter episode shows us that both the super regulator and the financial board were both super failures when it comes to the regulatory system. To the extent I should be clear that we should shut down the Financial Services Board and take away the regulatory functions from the CEO and give it to the registrars where it actually belongs. Now, I'm sure you might be aware of what happened with the Rosemary Hunter saga, but if not, let me just bring you up to speed with what happened. Rosemary Hunter was appointed as the Deputy Registrar of Pensions, so in the original model as the regulator of pensions. Now the legislation made her boss the actual regulator. Now The Pension Funds Act, crystal clear, says you cannot close a pension fund unless you have a statement that there are no funds in that pension fund. Now that's obvious because there's money in there, you close it, that money is just going to be stolen. So it's black and white. And how do you get it? Audited statement, independent audit, KPMG, PwC, they produce a statement, say we've audited, no funds in this. So when she arrives, she gets 1,000 funds to close, no statements, not one statement attached to any of those things. And she says, by law, I can't sign these documents. That's what the law says. And they said, well, you don't understand the law. She says, I am actually a lawyer and I've spent a life in pension, but if you're unhappy, I will brief senior counsel. Get senior counsel's opinion. Now, you don't need senior counsel's opinion to tell you if the law says you must have a statement, you must have a statement. So senior counsel comes back and says, that's what you're going to do. Then I said to her, no, look, don't worry about this because we've been doing this for a long time. We're closing all of these things. She said, then, as the registrar, I am going to open all those funds and make sure that we have certificates for all of those funds. Her boss, who is now the registrar, and legally the regulator, and this is where we make the switch from the rule of law to managerial centrum, says, look, I'm a boss, I'm telling you what to do, this is how we do it now, sign off those things and let's get on with our life. She says, I can't sign off because then I'd be violating the law. Now here's an interesting argument if you ever like to see an argument over here. The law says that you must make sure there are no funds in that statement. The Financial Services Board says, the law says that, but it doesn't tell us how we've got to check that. So we have the discretion how to check it. So we will put in a system, and as long as we have that system, then we've met our obligation. That system is we don't check it. And if we don't check it, we've done our job because nobody told us how to do our job. Whereas we have to say, no, I'm not going to do that. So her boss, which is now the CEO, says to her, then this is simply a labor matter, blatant insubordination, I'm firing you. So as far as the rule of law is concerned and regulation by law, ensuring the legal requirements are concerned, the law disappeared to be replaced by a managerial decision. So she said, okay, I'm going to appeal to the board itself. The board said this is just a labor relations matter, nothing to do. So we end up with getting rid of the law and replacing it with managerial decisions. And so we end up regulation from the rule of law and regulation by law by managerial centralism. So these decisions will no longer be based on the law or function in terms of the law. They will be simply decisions made by regulators. Now, if the regulator believes it can make the law, then obviously it's not concerned about the law because in its mind it becomes the law. So under those circumstances, its managerial decision becomes the rules which people must abide by and then gets rid of the rule of law as such. So the system of committees does not work. The system of people on these committees reporting to other people and being overridden by those other people, instead of regulating in terms of an objective law, does not work. The law disappears and we end up with a managerial system, a managerial centralist system, no rule of law. So the two main tenets upon which this legislation is built, one, committees and a managerial system of each person reporting to everybody else. Both of those, our experience in the last couple of years has shown it is a dismal failure. So before we start the system, we can see that it is going to be a failure. Now, the other problem which we want to have a look at, which becomes important when you come to things like transformation, barriers of entry, is a question about what happens when you design a regulatory system which has no financial benefits. That's what we've done. I mean, Parliament was advised there's no benefits that we can see. It's going to be the general good to the public. We're fixing the roof while the sun is shining. So the question is, what then happens? Then we're ending up with simply a deadweight cost. So what happens to our market which guarantees, which is a competitive market, guarantees the best performance? What happens under those circumstances when we start putting 6 billion rands of regulatory expenses into a system which is now and should be regulated by a competitive market? Well, it's not that difficult because economists have worked this out a long time ago. So I will just explain to you what will happen quite quickly. In a competitive market, we're going to end up with a company who's got a product having to incur expenses and then wants to make a profit. Being a competitive market, both those expensive and both those profits are as low as possible. So the competitive market gives you the ideal outcome, free of charge. No regulators, nothing at all. The competition itself is the regulator, and it's a very hard taskmaster. No problem. So what's the benefit of this? And we get this benefit from one of the world's greatest economists, Alfred Marshall, in 1908. He said, okay, we've got this competitive market, but if we didn't have this competitive market, what would happen? He said, well, then that company would be able to charge a price which the consumer will pay. Not what the market will pay, but what the consumer will pay. Then the consumer is going to pay more. When that consumer pays more, that additional amount is a surplus. But we only have competitive markets, and therefore every time you go to the shop and buy something in a competitive market, you actually enjoy a surplus which you've done absolutely nothing for, because the competitive market gives it to you the lowest possible price. So Alfred Marshall introduced the idea that everybody enjoys a consumer surplus as a result of that. So everybody in 1908 was very excited about that and said, no, that's very good. Easy. Economics 101, eh? Not difficult at all. Lovely stuff. So, economics of a competitive market. Expenses and profits are at their lowest. Why? Because the moment you try to push your prices up, your consumer goes to somebody else. And so when you're paying the lowest price, you're actually getting a fantastic deal, which you did not work. The market gives it to you for absolutely nothing. Alfred Marshall's consumer surplus consumes to the surplus. Alfred Marshall had a protege, Pigot, and Pigot then took this a little bit further and said, you know, society wants to be happy. And so what we want to measure is the social happiness of the total society. And he then took Alfred Marshall's consumer surplus and said, well, consumers enjoy this surplus and therefore they are happiest in a competitive market. And so he gave the world the concept of social welfare economics. And in 1932, Ronald Robbins comes along and says that the purpose of economics is to make sure we get an effective and efficient resource allocation. So, well, the competitive market gives us that as well. So competitive market, everybody enjoys the surplus which it can spend on something else. Because it's got money to spend, it gets happier. So the happiest market is one which has got a surplus. And it's the most efficient in the price one. Whatever money you've got, you can decide where to spend it. The market allows you to spend it where you like, and you get the most efficient resource allocation. Now what happens is people come along and say, no, but the market may not be efficient. There may be market failure because we may have monopoly profits. And this is where the deadweight costs become important. So in 1890, the idea was that markets may not be efficient. They might be failing. They don't give us the result because there could be a thing called monopoly profits. And therefore what we have to do is we have to regulate the market to get rid of those monopoly profits. So, simple. We have a company, it makes it, but it may be paying too much to the consumer because the market's not effective. So what was the answer? Answer was, let's regulate the market. Fantastic. But how much money can you spend? You can't spend any more than the benefit, otherwise the consumer's worse off. And that's why it's necessary with legislation to say what is the financial benefit of this legislation. Because if there is no financial benefit of this legislation, the consumer faces a deadweight cost which he may as well not have because it achieves nothing. It's just an expense which we have got. Okay, so what do we do with an inefficient market? The Sherman antitrust, we get market failure, regulation introduced to return to the competitive market. Numerous false allocations are there. First of all, the regulation is costless. Cost of regulation can never exceed the so-called monopoly profits. If not, the consumer worse off with regulation than without. If the cost of regulation exceeds the benefit, so any deadweight cost is simply making the consumer worse off. So we should not have a 6 billion rand deadweight cost because there's no reason to have that. It doesn't produce any benefits at all. Okay, sorry. Now I just wanted to, because this, as you are aware, because we now want to get some idea of the policy. Now we've had this long-running argument that the markets colluded to provide an increase in the cost of bread. And David Lewis then wrote a book about the markets just thieves at the dinner table. Just highly collusion, all the bad things, and as a result of that, what did it do? End up with taking money out of the hands and the mouths of the poor. That's what it did. So what I decided to do is to go and have a look at Pioneer Food, who paid well over R1 billion in fines because it's uncompetitive, to see how much profits were being given to the shareholders and this very uncompetitive time that it was, and taking all the money off the mouths of the poor. Anybody got any idea in cents per rand how much the shareholders were getting out of this collusive period? I mean, if they're colluding and they take, it must be like 20 cents in a rand or 30 cents in a rand. Okay, so I then went to have a look. Now this becomes important when we have a look at what happens to a market once you put the deadweight costs in. In 2007, 2.45 cents went to the shareholders, absolutely nothing at all. In 2008, 2.2 cents. 2009, 2.73 cents. In 2010, when they paid the fine and half the profits went to the government, 1.3 cents, 3.6. So we have no monopoly profits at all that can be detected. So any regulatory effort that's put in to introduce the market, to make the market better, can't make the market better. It is simply an expense which you are going to incur. Regulation makes the market worse off. Now we have got the bread market all sorted out and they're all never going to collude again. What's the profits at the moment? It's gone to 7 cents. So it's 3 times what it was when it was in a competitive, when it was colluding, 3 times better off. And what does the receiver of revenue get from the bread? 17 cents. So it was always getting 8 times what the shareholder was ever getting. So what now happens when we add these regulatory costs which can't improve the market at all? We now on the other side. It's no longer a competitive market, it is a regulated market. The profits are above, the expenses are above, and we have 6 billion rand added into the market. So everybody is worse off under these circumstances. So the regulated market, which is not the competitive market, which is the one that we are operating under, not subject to market discipline, substantial regulatory costs which achieve nothing, a deadweight 6 billion. Expenses could be higher than it was in the other one. Profits could be greater, as we see it's gone from 2 to 7, and it creates an inefficient. Now what would happen under these circumstances, anybody who wants to come into this market can't come into the market because there's 6 billion rands of regulatory costs and regulatory expertise which it does not have. So the regulated market then becomes an uncompetitive market which begins to exclude everybody. So in the UK, after 10 years of consultation on RDR, they decided they would ban all commissions and change it to a fee-based system. Within 6 months, they realized that half of their advisors would now be gone, and the poor would never get any advice at all. Highly regulated market imposes barriers to entry which people cannot enter into. So it's not surprising. In response to the Minister of Finance was asked when we introduced phase, what was the benefits? He came back and said we've deregistered 15,000 different advisors. So the success was to get rid of, and the regulated market does that, makes it impossible for people to get. So the regulated market becomes a barrier to entry, and in the South African context, hampers transformation. So the more complex the market becomes, the less possibility you are going to have of getting entrepreneurs into that particular market. It will destroy the market as such. So what do we have? We never had Alfred Marshall's consumer surplus because what he argued we don't have it, that accrues to the consumer. We've never had monopolies. We have never been able to find them in 100 years, which we've got. We couldn't find it. I couldn't find it in the Premier case. We now have an inefficient, regulated market which has imposed barriers to entry. So the system not only cannot work because the committee system does not work. It will bypass the rule of law and convert itself into a managerial system. And on top of that, we now have an inefficient market which imposes barriers to entry, which means that we cannot get transformation where it counts. And that is more entrepreneurs working. We're going to try and get transformation by transforming within the companies, but we won't be able to get transformation by new entrepreneurs entering into the market. Okay, so now let's just spend a little bit of time and looking at the two peaks which we have got. First peak, Prudential. Second peak, market conduct. First peak, Prudential's 300 million rand per annum starting in 1891. The second peak, 600 million in 2002. Okay, now the problem which arose, of course, and this leads us to a couple of interesting problems. The problem which arose, of course, the financial crisis was a banking crisis. It was the banks which collapsed. And so what we should be doing is having a look at how to make sure banks do not collapse. Not worry about the market as a whole, just worry about the banks, because that was the problem which we have. The banks were not unregulated. They were regulated in terms of the Basel system, Basel II. Now here's a very important constitutional principle which we need to have a look at, because what the Treasury says, we are introducing best international practices. In this case, we're introducing the Basel system. Basel, it's not a country. This Basel system is not a country. It's a private organization which has its head office in Basel, the biggest and most expensive building in Basel, by the way, under those circumstances. The banking industry worldwide, in Europe, in South Africa, spent billions of rands complying with the Basel system, which is not a government-regulated system, but a private system, which they put in. Now, just before the Northern Rock collapsed, the first bank in England to collapse in 135 years, just before, a week before, it announced it was Basel compliant. So it met all the regulatory requirements. So it's incorrect to say banks were not regulated. They were regulated and complied with all the regulations and collapsed. So the Basel II system was a failure, and that's why we've now got Basel III. So it's not a question of what we want to do now is make it a more draconian and system. It's a matter of find out why Basel collapsed. But instead of doing that, we're going to go and have a system which is a disaster. Now nothing was or is said about the Basel failure. When the government put out we want to have a safer system, it didn't criticize the Basel system, criticized the private sector. Said we want to have a more draconian and intrusive regulatory system to make sure it never happened. But the only way you can do that is by fixing the Basel system. He says, well, we don't understand the Basel system. It comes from Switzerland. How must we know what it is? So we're going to get those that we do know, which we're going to do. So instead, non-banking students are now going to be subject to intrusive and draconian regulation. That is an irrational non sequitur. If you have a bank that fails, you don't go to look at the insurance company, which is what they're doing, and put in regulation to regulate the insurance company. You go and regulate the banks. You know, we're not going to do the banks, we're just going to do it. And so this is part of that irrational explanation for the Twin Peaks, which we've never been able to find. It raises an interesting constitutional point, which was picked up by one of our senior counsel, Gilbert Marcus, in an opinion which he gave on the part of the Twin Peak regulation. Basel is not a country, and so we can't have a best international practice by doing what a private sector says to us. In fact, Gilbert Marcus argues, I don't know how you think you can do what a private sector says to you. The only way you can do that is by internalizing that into the country and making it a law, and not to look at the system. And I've had, when we get to Solvency II, and people come try to explain Solvency II, I say, can you please give me the document which has got Solvency II? No, there is no document. We know how to do it. So that's not going to help. You want a law which says that's what you've got to do. So regulation by non-governmental bodies does exist as to the legality of importing non-governmental bodies to regulate. We are having the same thing on international accounting standards. We've just had the accounting for insurance, exactly the same thing. That's not a country, and we're having the same thing with the International Association of Insurance Supervisors. They meet in Basel, they have a standard, and they say the rest of the world must do what we tell them to do, but they're not an elected body. They have no jurisdiction. They have no ability to make laws. And the whole world now says, let's do what they do, and that's the best international practice. Okay, Prudential Insurance started in 1891. The British Insurance Act, one market, one regulator, short-term and life. It's standardized in 1900. Now this is the current system for insurance companies, and I want you to see what the cost is to comply with it. 20 Rand, I think. 20 Rand if you can't find 7%, if you think you need to have a calculator, otherwise it costs nothing. There's only two things you need to do. One, you need to have a particular provision called IBNR, and that's 7% of the premiums. So if you know what your premiums are, we get from your accounting statement 7%, and then you have to have a reserve which is 25% of the premium. So the current system of regulation, the one which I advocate and we should continue with, costs nothing. The new system is going to cost hundreds of millions of rands to implement. I was at a presentation by a German insurer who came to South Africa and said his company is embarked on doing this, and it costs tens of millions of dollars every year to put. They have to collect 3,000 pages of data to give to the regulator. And he said, I suggest in South Africa you don't worry too much about all that information. Nobody can read it. So we go from a costless system to one which is going to be extremely costly. And not only that, it has worked extremely well. Now I have to be a little bit careful here, and I will have to correct my slide because I'll tell you why I have to correct my slide in a minute. I was misled on a particular point. It's worked extremely well for 100 years. The AA Mutual went insolvent or got into financial difficulties. Now remember that you have to have a reserve of 25%. So you've covered all your claims, 25% left over. That means that after you've paid all the clients, your shareholders still get some money. Now that happened to the AA Mutual, no problem at all. Everybody got paid, and there was 50 or 60 million rand left over.
Sorry, I didn't get paid. They only paid me for 2% on the rand.
Well, then somebody went wrong and you didn't get paid because the money was there, and the liquidators assured everybody it was paid, and the shareholders got something like 60 million rand back. So if you didn't get it back, it's not because the money wasn't there, it's simply something went wrong with the system. The same thing happened with IGI. Now the more recent ones, and this is where I have to get a bit wrong, I was under the impression that First Central, there was no loss to the public. Now, why do I have to be careful? Because Dr. Sandy Sandrock was the liquidator and he's here. And he tells me, no, there was a slight loss on that one, so I have to correct that one. And the second one, the recent one, second very small company, there is a loss on that one. Now, if the regulator applies the regulation correctly, there is no loss because there's a 25% surplus. So if he stops the insurance from operating, when you get to the 25%, then there would be no loss. In both First Central and Saxon, he didn't do that. There's reasons why he would put forward he could not do under those things. So the new system won't make any difference to that particular system. So for 100 years, the Prudential system at virtually no cost at all. We do pay the regulator 300 million rand, not sure why, but we do pay him 300 million rand, but there's no problem from the system. The new system which they're going to introduce is a completely different story. So we're going to introduce a system called SAM, Solvency II, for insurers. Now, Solvency II is based on Basel II. That's why it's called Solvency II, based on Basel II. It failed for the banks, which it was designed for. There's no reason to believe it can work for insurers. I don't think it's going to cause harm to the insurers, except insurers are going to find themselves holding an enormous amount of capital, which is unnecessary for them to hold as a result of Basel II. The cost goes from zero to millions, and added complexities which startup companies are unlikely to be able to comply with, and therefore is a barrier to entry for any new insurance companies which would like to get into the market. Market conduct. Now, that is a more troubling one, because as you have seen, if you looked at the costs in the current market conduct, which started in 2002, is now 600 million rand per annum. Prudential's 300 million rand per annum. So it's gone to twice what the Prudential in a very short period of time. The difficulty we have is to try and work out what is market conduct and why has it come into being. It's been quite a complex issue. I got one of my lecturers, a very bright young lady, to do a master's degree. So she spent 3 years trying to unravel this mystery. So I've had the great joy in the last 3 years of reading all the literature she could find to try and make sense out of it, which was very, very interesting. In South Africa, it started in 2002 with the introduction of phase. Phase was introduced because at the time they said that what is happening is that there are policies being sold to the public, and the public only pay for a year or two, and then they do not renew those policies, and so they spend all that money, which is a complete waste on the part of the public, and therefore we need to have a new system to make sure that they will. And then there was a cost to benefit. So if you take all the cost of the lapses which we have got, look at those costs, and more than will cover the cost of phase. And so for the first time in history, we had a proper cost to benefit study done. This is going to solve the problem of lapses, and we're going to be much better off. The only problem is, if you now go and look at the data and say, did it solve the problem? It didn't solve the problem. The lapses have gone up, nothing got solved. And phase now has lost sight of what the original objective was and costs us 600 million as it took on a life of its own. It now does its own thing. It creates itself into a market conduct regulator. Okay. Now, when we had the financial crisis in 2008, when there was the commissions of inquiry in England to find out what did the FSA do, and the FSA had to admit it actually did not know too much about the prudential management of banks. And so they decided to return the banks to the Bank of England. But what do you do with the FSA, which has now got this 10,000 pages of market conduct regulation? So they decided, just let's leave it and give it a new name and let it carry on. So market conduct is something which really arose by accident as they lost sight of what they were supposed to do. Exactly the same thing in South Africa. Market conduct was supposed to reduce policy lapses. That did not happen. They forgot that what they got to do, so they get a life all of their own, which is very disruptive to the market itself. Now, if you understand the history as to why we've got this, then you'll understand there's been very little appetite for other countries to introduce Twin Peaks. For them to do that, they would have to go and convince all of their central banks that they must become regulators of the financial market. And most central banks will tell you we have enough trouble trying to regulate the banking system without worrying about pension funds and everything else. So most of them will say, please take your problem somewhere else and don't make it our problem. What they should have done is re-looked at what market conduct is doing and then go back to the root, which I'm going to say. In South Africa, as I've already pointed out, the functions of the Reserve Bank are encapsulated in the Constitution. Nothing in the Constitution allows the Reserve Bank to regulate insurance companies. So to my mind, what you will have to do is amend the Constitution. They haven't done that, they're not planning to do that. So we are amending the mandate of the Reserve Bank, which is what the public protector wanted to do, without actually realizing we're amending it and without changing the Parliament. There is a very vague provision in the Constitution when it comes to the Reserve Banks, which says the Reserve Bank can do anything which Reserve Banks normally do, central banks normally do. Well, central banks do not normally regulate insurance companies. So that provision will not be able to allow that to happen. Okay, I won't go into great detail into what gave rise to the problems of market conduct, which is what I wanted to deal with. I think the message is fairly clear. We're ending up with a regulator, market conduct regulator, trying to do something which it has no clear mandate to do. And in England, the argument and the criticism was it had become the champion of the consumer. And if it becomes the champion of the consumer, it's not an impartial regulator. It has to become a regulator. And so it's lost its mandate in that direction. Okay. Now let me just deal quickly with the constitutional concerns which we have about this system which we've now put into practice. One, what we are witnessing is a new phenomena, and it's a new phenomena that is really from 2013 onwards in South Africa. I think we could have seen it a little bit earlier. And that is what I've called the rise of the unitary state within the state. As we know that the state, there are three powers: an executive power, there's a legislative power, parliament, and then there's the judicial power, those three separate powers. And in any state, we are supposed to have these three separated. Now, what has happened in the legislation leading up to Twin Peaks and now being encapsulated better than I've seen in the other legislation? These are systematically being brought into one institution. So the regulators find that they are taking, or they design the legislation that they get legislative powers. They have their own courts, their tribunals. They impose their own fines and they keep their own fines. And so when you are finished, you have a self-contained institution which has no further need for Parliament, has no further need for the courts, and has no further need for the receiver of revenue because it levies its own taxes. So it becomes a self-standing unitary state within the state. Unprecedented in the history of the world. Why? Because in 800 the Magna Carta was designed to prevent this from happening. So it's been happening slowly, but now it's become more clear. So let's have a look when we have a look at them. Three powers in one, within the state with separate powers. The TWIP is one of those institutions. Regulators carry out the executive functions. Legislators, they make their own laws. They have, in the provisions of the Act, they have the ability to make a whole variety of laws, never going back to Parliament at all. So Chapter 1, regulatory instruments. So in the past, you'd have to have regulation made by the minister. Now the regulator makes his own regulatory instrument. He can issue standards, guidance notice, directives. He can take administrative action, which means he can work out what he thinks people should do, and this is simply an administrative action I am taking. So no longer, as we have in the Pension Funds Act, a very clear law which says you don't wind up a fund unless you make sure there are no assets in it. There are no legislative requirements at all. The regulator will make his own laws as he goes along. It has their own courts, Chapter Financial Services Tribunal. It has a review panel. So if you don't like the decision of a court, you normally appeal to a higher court. Don't worry, you can appeal to a higher tribunal within the Financial Service Board. Totally self-contained. It has an Ombudsman's Regulatory Council. So at the moment we have a series of ombudsmen, and if you have a dispute, you can go to the Ombudsman, will assist you to resolve it. Now there's going to be an overarching council. Not sure what that council could do. One of its functions is to approve new ombudsmen. The insurance industry has had 2 ombudsmen in 40 years. It's going to wait a very long time for some more work to come its way. Now, I think what is going to happen, it will eventually then see itself as being the overarching administrator for the ombudsman. So it will start giving instructions to the ombudsman how to make decisions. So the judicial function will not be in terms of the law, but again, centralized managerialism making those decisions. Now, I have quoted this clause in the bill, Chapter 13, Clause 165, because some time ago we met with senior counsel on another issue. We said to senior counsel, do you know what's happening in this legislation? Is happening. Is when a fine is imposed, the regulator keeps the fine. He said, no, that's not possible. That's never been possible. So I want to quote the section. In section Chapter 3, Clause 1, when they impose a fine, that fine must be paid to the financial sector regulator. So it goes to the regulator, not to the National Treasury where fines are supposed to go, which means there's an incentive. Worse than that, one of the things which is very important is that the presiding officer has no concern where the money comes from. Because if you say you're only going to get the money if you find the man guilty, because your salary will pay, he's going to find you guilty. Now in England, about 2 years or 18 months ago, they tried to change the law. And they said that in future, when people appear in a criminal case, they must pay the cost of the case. The moment that legislation came out, 60 magistrates resigned. Why? Because you'll undermine the entire judicial system. The first call for all the money that the fines goes to pay for the judiciary that's sitting over there. Fundamental violation of the fundamental laws which have been governing courts for centuries under those circumstances. It levies its own taxes. Now, for a very long time, I've been pointing out the levy is a tax. And of course, National Treasury say, no, it's not a tax, it's a levy. We have levies all over the place. You know, everybody's got a levy. And so this time, there was a little bit of a surprise for National Treasury. Okay. Sorry, where's that? I seem to have missed my one. Okay. I seem to have missed one. Let me just know. I think it's coming on here. Okay, there it is. So, National Treasury said to, or the Standing Committee said to National Treasury, is this levy not a tax? And they said, no, it's a levy. I said, but, you know, we think it might be a tax. Don't you think you should relook at that? So, National Treasury said, okay, I'll tell you what we'll do is we'll go and get a legal opinion. So the legal opinion came back and said, legal opinion says, look, it's probably not a tax, but to be safe, let's treat it as a tax. So from now on, the levies which are imposed will be imposed as a tax, which means it should be a money bill. So now the levies cannot just be part of the act, they have to be in terms of a separate act which has now been drafted. That bill does not meet the function of a money bill as correctly understood in law. Levies. 100 years ago, the leading constitutional lawyer, which is Dicey, made the constitutional point. Not only must taxes be imposed with the consent of Parliament, to use the very clear language of the Victorian age, he said, not a penny can be spent unless it is in terms of appropriation bill. This act, the new money bill that they have, simply says we can now levy something, doesn't have a budget, not approved by Parliament and not controlled by Parliament at all. Okay. What we've seen over here has also been seen in the United States, where we're passing laws which impose separate taxes. In the United States, to their great surprise, one of their think tanks, equivalent to the Free Market Foundation, went through the literature and then pointed out there were over 700 acts in the United States which allowed different agencies to impose their own taxes. And the United States Senate and Congress were somewhat alarmed at that and said we will now stop the earmark taxes from coming into being. So there's been a war launched upon them. So we need to do the same thing in South Africa. We've gone a little bit along the way by recognizing that these levies are taxes, and they need to go through a money bill process. We need to refine that money bill process, as is happening in the United States, to make sure we do not have the abuses. We've already had those abuses in South Africa. Every time you go to the supermarket, you know you pay a tax to get a plastic bag. When that was introduced in 2003, it was to go and build a recycling plants. To this day, no recycling plant has yet been built. Fortunately, that money is paid into the National Treasury, and so the National Treasury says, look, it's just a tax. It wasn't supposed to be. There was one which is levied on tyres. Carte blanche ran an exposure for many years to show what's been happening to that, and the minister did nothing. Now she's finally taken steps to close down the organization. She will never recover the billions of rands paid under that. So we have to join the United States and get the earmark taxes, these levies, under constitutional control, which has not happened. Okay. Let me just give you my final conclusion and a solution to this problem. Let's return to what works. One market, one regulator. So we go back to the insurance market with its regulator, the banks with its regulator, and so on. I would say shut down the Financial Services Board or redefine its mandate. The Chief Executive of the Financial Services Board ceases to be the regulator. All the deputy regulators which they've got, like the pension funds deputy regulation, they all become the regulators. So we get back to the idea of one market, one regulator, one act, one regulator. Get rid of this monstrosity of an act called the Twin Peaks. Return to the rule of law. Regulation by law, not by managerial centralism. This system of committees which all report to somebody else, it's going to degenerate into decrees through managerial systems, not by the law. They reinstate the separation of powers. The regulations could fund test cases to be adjudicated by the courts, operate in terms of the harmful practice sections which exist in the law, and abandon the Twin Peaks system. And I think that brings me to the end of what I had to say. Jane, you said I could go until 1 o'clock. I'm 5 minutes over time.
That's wonderful, thank you. Quite a lot of information there, quite a lot to take in and assimilate. Any questions for Professor Vivian or for Leon Louw?
Yeah, one very deep concern that I have is that the involvement of the Department of Health.
Yeah.
They're angling for the national health insurance, which is going to cost hundreds of billions if it ever succeeds, which will be equivalent to doubling VAT virtually.
Yeah.
And if they are putting their paws onto this whole procedure, it's going to really muddy it because they haven't a clue what they're doing in terms of finance.
No, I think that's true, because if they put their claws on it and have a muddled type of thinking, then the muddled type of thinking appears not as laws, but as directives and regulations and instructions, and you can't make sense out of that. I mean, you can't make sense out of national health to start off with. Imagine now when you start trying to put that into some sort of documents, series of documents, it's just not be able to make sense. Go back to the rule of law. Let's have clear laws which we tell people what to do. But I agree with you on that. Any other questions?
You talk about regulation actually increasing profits. I thought that was an interesting idea. Is there evidence for that?
I think what happens is that in a competitive market, things are clear cut. And so you can then work out what your costs are and things like that. In a regulatory market, you then find yourself faced with a great deal of uncertainty. So as a result of that, it becomes more difficult to price your goods. And you price uncertainty, and then you end up with a greater profit. Now, people might want to disagree with me, but I have a reason for saying that. Sandy. Okay.
Just to add a response to that, the bread cartel was mentioned. Sorry, I didn't see you ask the question. No, the bread cartel was mentioned. One of the things is that everyone thinks what they did was force them to lower the price of bread. No, the regulation actually said they were charging too little. The bread was too cheap. It's what they call predatory pricing. So that they forced them to raise the price. So the profits went up. The pioneer was told you were selling bread too cheap. There's this weird myth that nobody's actually bothered to read the report. And it happens over and over again. It happened when they broke up the cement cartel. Profits went up. Look at this thing of the stadium, this 2010 stadiums and the so-called collusion amongst the construction companies. Firstly, when they were colluding, profits never went up. So what was this collusion about? The price per seat in the stadiums was the global standard. What had happened is there'd been a portion. Now they've been told that they did something wrong, and they've had hundreds of billions of fines, hundreds of millions of fines imposed. That's going to be recovered from the government, to whom because that's where most of their work comes from. And it's going to be interesting to see. I haven't done it, but I think if you went now and looked at their profits, you'll find that their profits have actually gone up since they were fined. Because what this is going to do is restrict the market, stop new entries coming in. They have to recover the money. The rate of return will stay the same, but the turnover will be higher. So it'll be a higher rate over a bigger amount, which in terms of nominal amounts will actually be more rands profits. And that's what one would predict from the so-called breaking up of the construction company cartel, which made no profit from that. In fact, all it did, it's a different story, but it simply just said, since no one South African company can build more than one big stadium, they had to actually apportion it. They all watched each other very vigilantly to see that nobody overcharged or overpriced. That was reflected in the annual returns and the cost per stadium. And I think, I haven't looked, but I think it'll be an interesting thing to do, see what happened to the construction company profits after the ruling. And the chances are they've gone up nominally, probably the same rate, but over a bigger amount, paid for by the taxpayer.
Diane.
Thank you. So on the same basis then, the insurance companies could be, and the banks could actually be incentivized not to challenge these matters that you describe as unconstitutional, because it actually may suit their purpose to dominate markets.
I don't know, I'm not sure everybody actually understands profits may go up. See, I'm not so sure. I can't understand the why, I can't understand how financial institutes have reacted to this legislation. Because I said, as far as I know, I'm the only one opposing it. They think
So
it's
that's why it's baffling, isn't it?
it is baffling.
So it's either fear, fear of regulators, or alternatively there is another incentive, or both.
But isn't a simple one entry barriers?
Yeah, the benefit.
If you're in the you love it when the government makes it impossible for anyone else to join. Especially if you're so-called white monopoly capital, what more could you want to stop transformation than Twin Peaks? It's like created by the Brudebond, I think.
So I'm not sure everybody would understand profits may go up.
Sorry, I think that's the...
But I think they do understand barriers to entry increase. Therefore, less people can enter. And they have seen that, at the lower end, they've knocked out that part of the market. But regulators around the world have seen that, so that's known. But the profit one's more interesting.
I think there's a general rule of regulation that anyone who is already in wants regulation. You want more regulation when you're in. It's what Michael O'Dowd used to call getting into the castle and pulling up the drawbridge behind you. That's why the regulators love it.
Yeah, I mean, that explains why regulations exist.
Yeah.
Because there's a symbiotic relation between the regulation and the industry. One can't understand why it exists, but it does exist. Okay, any more questions? Hard ones now for Leon, eh?
I may just make a comment, and your plastic bag analogy is interesting because people have a huge difficulty in understanding a phenomenon called large-scale integration of small numbers. The plastic bags over the time has accounted to billions of rand into the government coffers. When you talk about the cost of 4.8 billion or something, when it gets to individual policies, it becomes a far more manageable amount, 5 rand, 10 rand, whatever, and people don't worry about that. And I think that's the danger. The government or governments actually bank on this phenomenon. And I think when we talk about regulation and so on, when they start trying to regulate things like pricing and working it in, you must watch where the end ends up.
Yeah.
It's a huge amount of money. I refuse to actually buy plastic bags in my household because it's my little bit of rebellion. Because it's so insidious. People don't realize that the 60 cents, it's now 60 cents, started 24 cents.
Yeah.
The 60 cents ends up with billions in the end.
And that is not being used to do reclamation.
Exactly, it doesn't do what it was set out to do. So the point on Twin Peaks, it doesn't set out what it wants to do actually, and then doesn't have any targets for when it's successful.
So I can't help but add on the question of plastic bags, the regulation is that they have to be thicker,
Yes.
which means they're less biodegradable. People don't realize plastic is biodegradable, it's simply carbon. Thin bags get hard and disappear. Thick bags are, if you want to pollute the environment, you have a plastic bag regulation.
I'm sorry, so a question? I was going to make a comment.
I need to raise this question to Mr. Louw.
Better, I feel better. My friend.
Oh, yeah. Well, he said something like it is actually desirable for the bill to be stopped. And what I know is that the bill has already been approved by the National Assembly, I think last month in June, which means the bill can actually be en route to the president to be asserted into law. Now, my question would be, what mechanism, perhaps, do you propose or do you have in terms of really blocking that bill to be promulgated, in other words?
Yes, you're right. Well, firstly, let me just say, in the Free Market Foundation, we never regard any laws cast in stone. We always think it's amendable and repealable, and we've had lots of success stories in achieving that. So for us, it's never finished. Secondly, you might actually be able to persuade the state president, which has happened a few times, started with President Mandela, who in response to inputs we provided that some bills were probably unconstitutional, he refused to sign them and referred them to the Constitutional Court. And under him, 3 bills that had been passed and in fact supported and voted for by all the political parties, so it wasn't party political, were rejected by the Constitutional Court. And then when he was president, Kgalema Motlanthe did the same. And recently, President Zuma refused to sign, I forget which bill, a Labour bill, I think it was, also on the grounds of him being told by his own legal advisors is unconstitutional, even though it's gone through Parliament. So before the President assents to a bill, the President has the power under the Constitution to refer it to the Constitutional Court for constitutionality review. We hope that the current President will do what his predecessors have done. And then even if it is passed into law, it then has to be implemented. And the date of implementation one can have pushed out. And you might, during that time, persuade people that it's not viable or can't be implemented. And some will be implemented, some not. But we will continue to lobby then for its amendment or substantial repeal, as we did with phase. We never accepted that phase was cast in stone. And in fact, it's now going. It's been replaced by something else. But nonetheless. So I think for us, it's still a case of the current technical administrative procedures, and ultimately, of course, there's a Constitutional Court. Can be passed, assented to by the President, implemented, and hopefully we will find somewhere, someone, maybe not an insider, because there is a possibility they all see this as to their advantage, but we might find somebody who's willing to fund a constitutional challenge. Could be pro bono. We've brought 6 constitutional cases in the Free Market Foundation. We've won them all. The most recent one on paper we lost, but in the substantive thing was actually a huge victory, the labor extension of labor contracts. So we would, as far as we are concerned, this is still open season. And so there are various levels and various ways. We will now try to persuade the state presidents, the presidency. And the presidency itself, by the way, should quite welcome what we have to say, because it, after all, produced a socio-economic impact assessment guidelines. And if they see that their own guidelines have been violated, the president might say, no, hold on a sec, I'm not going to assent to this. So we will continue battling at that level, and we're politically neutral, completely, genuinely. I mean, people often don't understand that we mean what we say. So we would look to the president to do the right thing as the president. We're not influenced by some of the baggage that people attach to him.
More an observation than a question. If you look at generation X, Y, and Z, who are pretty much anarchists, and with the legal system dominating the rights of people, it's very interesting to me to see what would happen with the technology of blockchain and cryptocurrencies in alternative methods of providing services to people other than be bound by law, which has restricted us as humans for many years. So I'm very interested to see what would happen with these kinds of systems and implementations, and how the younger people who basically are governed by sharing would actually change the way they do business and totally ignore something like this.
I think you're right when it comes to banks, of course, because that is an alternative. But the other services, I think you're buying real services. So it's more difficult to see how it's going to affect them. But it's interesting.
It's more about value than being restricted.
Yeah. It's an interesting observation. No more questions? Thank you.
Robert, thank you very much. And thank you to the audience for coming along. That's a very comprehensive and thoroughly worrying review. The next Free Market Foundation media briefing is next week. It's on the 19th of July, same time, same venue, and we're looking at the NHI white paper. So please do come along to that. That's also a very, very important topic for all of us in South Africa. Otherwise, please feel free. Robert will be around for a little while, and Leon, if you want to have a chat. Otherwise, have a sandwich. Thank you.